see we've tried many different things. We're cooperative producers for Feral Cattle Company. We try to, our goal, I guess, is to produce our low cost production, breed cattle that fit the environment and are easy fleshing and don't require a lot of props to keep them. We're not really focusing on high yearling weights and weaning weights, trying to find animals that can fit our environment and yet be fertile without having to feed them for that high production. We desire to improve lifestyle and our land. I would have to say after organic crop farming for the last 20 years, I haven't really improved my land as much as I had hoped. I thought it would improve more farming it organically, but I think the tillage that we do at the time I began, I didn't really realize how detrimental tillage is to soil biology and soil health. I also know that it's a lot of work in the summer trying to take care of a lot of cattle, trying to harvest the winter feed and do all the organic crop farming, the tilling, the cultivating, all of the weed control that we do. It's really a busy time in the summer. Another factor for us, and that would be different for everybody, but we have a really limited access to cheap or lower quality hay. And through the network that I have with ranchers throughout the US, through the Farrow Discussion Group, we are able to talk with other farmers from other areas, and a lot of people have certain niches or cheaper feed, I would say, lower quality feed. But in our area, it's primarily dairy farms, and alfalfa is pretty high cost, and corn and beans is quite common, even though all of our land is highly erodible. It's just expensive land, so that's part of our context. So I'll start off by talking about our cost of hay production. Jared and I talked about this a few years ago, our hay, and it was kind of a light bulb moment for me, just kind of talking about how our costs really are. And so in our organic cropping system, we were having seeding down oats, underseeded with alfalfa and grass seeding, and we would typically leave it for 3 years, sometimes even just 2 years. And we expect about 4 tons of hay production per acre per year, which with our baler is about 7 bales per year. And so figuring out the stand depreciation or the stand establishment costs are about $150. That's the seed and the planting and tillage that might be required for that. So that works out to those costs listed there. As I said before, land costs have gotten really expensive, and it's hard for a beef cow to compete on that kind of land. And so that's what we're trying to do, is how can we be profitable, and we enjoy cattle. We think it's good for the land, and it's something we would like to continue. But land rent at $200 an acre is I would say fairly common for this area now. And if you look at the cost of producing hay on that, that's $50 a ton based on our yields. The fertilizer value of hay, I got that really off the internet. So you may come up with something different, but it was estimated to be about $33 a ton. The machinery harvest cost, what I did there was use Iowa State custom rate charges. So I used some of those figures and then some from areas, local people that do say hay cutting. We've got a custom guy just down the road that does it. And so I used his figures and cost of raking, and that's what it works out to be. Now, it doesn't mean that someone here isn't really mechanically inclined and able to do it much less than that. But those are the custom rate charges. And then I feel that I probably, with the limited amount of hay that I would make and the machinery required and having all that hay, the labor and staff to be able to do that, I don't feel that my costs would be any less than that. The when you add all those things together, the total cost of the hay is just under $90 a bale, or about $156 a ton. And for a beef cow, that's pretty expensive. For us, with our bales, on average, we get about 32 cow days out of every bale that we make. If the hay is really good quality and the cows like it, it's kind of like me when my wife makes a really good supper, I can eat a lot. And if it's not very good, it takes me a little longer to eat it. And we notice that with our cows, the poor quality feed that we feed them, the less they eat of it. But on average, that's what it costs us, is about $2.73 per cow day if we fed our own hay.
And you'll notice that we talk a lot about our numbers, and you guys will have maybe different numbers and different things, but for us, we use cow days as a kind of our metric, and you'll see us use this throughout the presentation, is just what it takes to feed one of our cows, which I think this last fall we weighed was 1,150 pound cow average, or right around there. So that's just kind of the metric we're going to use as we talk about the different feeding options that we've experimented with over the last couple of years.
So the other option, if you're not going to raise your hay, is buying hay. And this fall, hay prices are always going to vary. And it, again, like I said in the context, every area is different. I have friends that can buy round bales of hay for $25 a piece. But by the time I look at shipping them from there to me, the cheapest I can do is about $115 a ton. And our costs that I could find this fall, when I looked at getting enough hay in for the winter, was about $140 a ton. And our costs, I said before, is about $160 a ton. So those are what figures how it works out, trying to figure out what it would cost to feed our cows this winter. Bale size, quality, all vary quite a bit. When I first started farming years ago, I was dairy farming, and they had hay auctions. They would have a lab come out and do infrared testing to do an NIR test on the hay, and they told you the weights, and it was a lot easier. But I find at the hay auctions in my local area, they never weigh the bales, and they give you no forage tests. And most of the farmers, when I call up to find out about buying hay, almost none of them had tests. So you're kind of on your own there, hoping, maybe they'll do a test for you, but the prices, for high quality feed, they're usually tested, but a beef cow, it's pretty hard to justify, paying $200 a ton for hay. And when I talked about our average cost of hay, that's doing baleage, doing, the best job we can. And we have over the years sold organic hay to dairymen and gotten from $200 to $300 a ton for hay. And we don't feed that to our cows. Typically, they're getting the stuff that's, maybe the oat hay or rye hay, the poor quality stuff. But, if we are going to feed that hay to our cows and I can sell it for $200 a ton, then I kind of have to charge my cow that too. At least that's the way we look at it. So we just don't feel like we need to be feeding that good quality. So we would prefer to get cheaper hay in or graze our way out of it. We are able, if we buy hay, to import fertility to our land, and that's a real bonus. Also, if we don't make hay on our farm, that frees up our land to be able to graze. And with some of the talk of, grazing off on some other people's land in the winter, we can look at it as well. If we can graze cattle on our farm in the summer and maybe make just as much money off of that and not do any haying, and that'll pay for the cost of our cattle going somewhere else.
Yeah. And as you look at those numbers, I know for us, talked about it being a light bulb moment. Part of that was kind of shocking. I mean, it was a light bulb moment, like, oh, we need to change things, but that's because we realized this number was so high. And if you look at that and say, well, I'm making it cheaper than that. I own my equipment, my land is paid for, there is real cost that you have to attribute to those things. And if the only way that you can make your cows work is because you make hay for free, or you give it hay for cheap and it's being subsidized by the farming enterprise, then your cow-calf herd may not actually be profitable. So I would encourage you all to take a look at your numbers and your context. Maybe your land is more expensive, maybe it's less expensive, maybe your costs are different, but really analyze your costs, your true costs, and look at it almost as a separate enterprise. What is your haying enterprise being paid by the cattle? What if you were going to sell this hay to someone else, if these weren't your cows, what would you charge them? Or if you were going to make hay for someone else, what would you charge them? And then charge the cows that price for the hay and charge the haying enterprise that price for the custom, and figure out what your costs are. But this challenged us. I mean, we thought, this really doesn't work to make this. And so we thought, how can we reduce this costs? How can we bring our expenses down? And ideally, the best way to do it is by grazing. Every day that our cows are grazing is one less day that we're feeding hay. And all that hay that we're feeding, first of all, that has an expense, but all of those experiences that we talked about and that labor and work that goes into making that hay, we have to do that. And so how can we get less hay altogether? And the first way we kind of tried to do that was with sorghum sedan grass grazing. And I know this is on custom grazing, and we'll get to the custom experience we did, but we first tried a lot of these things on our farm, and that's where we got a lot of the data, the cow days, what kind of production we could get, what our costs were experiments done on our own farm and trials done on our own farm. But the first thing we wanted to try was sorghum sedan grass, and we saw that as being an advantageous cover crop to use for a couple of reasons. First of all, in our area, in our context anyway, the majority of our pasture lands are cool season grasses, and we get 60% of our pasture production in May and June, so early in the season, and that leaves us with lower production later in the season. And we saw warm season annuals, sorghum sedan in particular, as an opportunity for us to push that production later into the season, to get more growth later in the season. And also, we saw it as an advantage that it grows all year and it never loses quality until a frost, whereas perennial pastures, if we wanted to let it continue to grow and not come to it later, it gets mature, gets ranked, loses quality, and slows down production early. By the end of June, maybe you won't be getting much growth. It'll be smothering out new growth. And sorghum just continues to grow and put on more biomass and produce more biomass. And it doesn't lose quality until late in the year. And also, as you can see in that photo on the left, even though there's quite a bit of snow, you can still have access to that sorghum sedan grass. And we saw that, not exactly being the case with perennial pastures. And cows can dig through snow, but certain limits of snow or certain types of snow, heavy, wet snow, may make that more troublesome and may flatten that more. And we saw sorghum as an opportunity to keep that biomass above snowfall and make it easier for the cows to get it, especially as we graze late in the winter. And so that's one way that we tried grazing sorghum. The other way that we tried grazing sorghum was grazing it in the summer, late summer in August and September. And we did that at that time to allow our perennial pastures to stockpile. We wanted our perennial pastures to get rest, 30, 60 days of rest, and really regrow and be prepared for more late season grazing with our cows on the perennial pasture. We got a range of production off of these acres. And again, our metric for measuring production is specifically cow days. How many cow days were we able to get per acre? And with the sorghum sedan grass, we saw pretty consistently between 170 to 180 cow days per acre. Even when we were grazing, in that last photo I showed, we grazed that to as late as early January 8th or January 10th, right around there. And we were still getting that 170 cow days per acre. And the green stuff that we were grazing here, we got around 180 cow days per acre, and that was grazing quite a bit in heavy rainfall, and a lot of it was getting mudded under and wasted. So there's potential in good weather even to get more than 180, upwards of 200 cow days per acre, potentially more. And you can see kind of the total cost that went into producing that sorghum divided by the cow days. Gets you the cost per cow day. And so in that 170 to 180 cow day range that we were seeing on our sorghum, that brought our cost to $1.74 or even $1.64 per cow day, as opposed to that $2.16 we were getting when we were buying in the cheapest hay that we could find, or $2.56 if we were buying in the more realistic price for what hay we could find in our area. And so we thought, this is pretty great. This is a good opportunity for us to reduce our costs. And another advantage of sorghum Sudan grass is that you can plant it this, middle to end of June and still get this much production. And that leaves April, May, and early June to get a whole nother crop. And we did harvest another crop, and that particular crop was typically a hay crop that we made prior to planting the sorghum Sudan grass. And in our situation, we've used rye and oats. This picture on the left here was actually taken on the farm that we custom grazed on. We'll talk later, and there's clover in there, so that's not what we did, but we would do an oats, either a rye that was planted the year before that we harvested off as hay and then planted to sorghum Sudan grass, or we planted an oat and pea mixture that we harvested off as hay before planting to sorghum Sudan grass. And rather than getting 170 acres of sorghum, we were able to get 170 days of sorghum grazing plus the 120 plus days of cow days that we were able to harvest with that hay, for a total of 290 cow days generated on 1 acre in this system. Obviously, there are additional costs that go into making that hay, and those costs are labeled here. And so with the seed cost, the cutting and baling costs, as well as the sorghum costs, plus land rent, that brought total cost to $477, which when you subtract, which when you divide amongst those total of 290 cow days, works out to around $1.64 per cow day that we were able to get off of those acres that we did that. And so that was kind of our first trial that we got off of our farm, and some of the data that we collected and the numbers we worked out, and we thought, this has some real potential. And in our area, we happened to know a farmer about 10 miles away who was interested in getting cover crops and livestock integration on his farm. He was a no-till crop farmer, corn and soybeans, and was interested in regenerative agriculture and building his soil, and wanted to do more of that. And maybe actually before I go on too much, I should stop and see if there are any questions up till now that that are in the chat or that anyone has.
If anyone has a question, go ahead and pop it in, but Jared, no one has entered a question yet.
Sure. Awesome. You must be doing a fantastic job so far. Good work. So yeah, we saw this as potential, and we had this local farmer who was interested in getting livestock integration and cover crops on his land. He wanted to break up his cycle of corn, soybeans, and get something different in there, in particular a cover crop and grazed livestock, but he also wanted it to be profitable for him. And we had done this. He came out and took a look at it and saw, it looked pretty good and the numbers worked out. And so we thought we would try and set up something with him to be beneficial to both of us. And so this is kind of the goal or the outline of what our plan was for the winter of 2019 and 2020, and that we worked with him. And he had about 180 acre field of corn that he had harvested off. And our plan was to graze on that crop residue until either A, it was gone, or B, it was buried in snow. And then we were going to move them from the crop residue to the sorghum Sudan grass that he had planted, a field of sorghum Sudan grass with this same mixture where we had harvested off hay and then planted sorghum. And then the plan after that, once that was either gone or buried in snow, was to feed that hay that he had harvested earlier in the season back out on those same acres that we had harvested that hay off of, so that the fertility was never leaving. The rates that we worked out that we thought would generate a profit, an adequate profit for him and for us, was 50 cents per cow day for crop residue grazing, $1.60 per day for sorghum Sudan grass grazing, and $2 per day for bale grazing at the end. And his expenses that would go into that were $208 that it would cost him to make the hay on those on 1 acre. And that's including all the seed and fertility and harvest costs, $69 for the planting and the seed costs into the sorghum Sudan, and then $200 an acre land rent for a total of $477. The estimates based on our past experience was that we would charge $1.60 per day per cow day for grazing times 170 cow days per acre, plus the $2 per day times 132 cow days per acre in the hay, for a total of $536. And our hope was that this would be advantageous for both of us and that he would get to keep all of that fertility on his land. He would be able to build soil. He would be able to get animal impact on his land, break up his crop rotation, and generate a $59 per acre return to that those expenses. It didn't work out quite how we had hoped, and we learned a bit from that. What ended up happening was we brought our cattle there on December 10th to that cornfield, and we grazed for quite a while. We were able to graze from December 10th all the way till January 22nd, and got about 47 cow days per acre on that field, and could have gotten more, but at the end of January 22nd, the snow, if you recall back to last January, it was getting kind of really cold and then warm and cold and warm, and there was a lot of snow that was melting and then freezing, melting, freezing, and it was packing down a lot of the stuff, and ended up really just they weren't able to get to the corn stalks anymore. And so at that point, then we moved them to the sorghum Sudan grass, and we learned that it doesn't stand up quite as well as we had hoped in that kind of a weather, in that kind of an environment, and a lot of that sorghum Sudan grass got pressed under the snow as well. We were only able in the end they were essentially, the cows went out there and they nipped off the top of the sorghum Sudan grass that was above the snow, but we weren't able to get much more than that. And we're able to get about 45 cow days per acre, which I'm sure you can understand would shift those numbers. Those costs were the same, but the income were drastically less than expected. And so that was unfortunate. He did that following spring, after the snow had melted, the ground got cold, and he had a small group of cows. He turned some out and got some grazing at that point. But since he was a no-till farmer, he didn't want to worry about hurting the soil too much in that mud season in that spring. And so once the ground got warmer again, he pulled them off. So he was able to harvest a few more cow days per acre, but not what he or we had hoped for and expected. And then we bale grazed from February 8th to February 18th. Dad, I don't know if you have anything to add about that experience there.
Was there any questions? I saw a few pop through. Anything you wanted to cover now?
Yeah, that'd be great. Interject real quick. So one of our listeners wants to know, they said, thanks for the explanation of your costs. Is the no-till farmer you're working with using a 3-year rotation with corn, soy, rye, or oats, or sorghum Sudan grass, or what is their rotation?
He was traditionally corn and soybeans, and then he started adding wheat. He tried, actually before that, sorghum was, I think it was winter wheat, and then maybe oversowed some red clover, frost seeded it on, or it was spring wheat. So those were the 3 crops. He primarily, in our area, almost nobody grows wheat. It's corn and soybeans, and that's it. But he's exceptional, I would say. He was trying to grow wheat. And
the majority of his acres would still be corn and soybeans, though, but he's experimenting on some farms and some fields.
And they're also curious, and you might be getting to this, if you're doing any custom grazing on cover crops seeded after a corn soybean harvest, and how much you're charging for it. But we can table that if you're going to be getting to it.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
Great. And then there's another individual wondering about the water situation. So maybe how do you get water to the animals?
Yeah, we'll get to that too.
Great.
Yeah, good questions. Yeah, thanks. Anything else to add on this, Dad, then? Or...
No, that's good.
Okay.
So this is what we did currently this year, 2020, 2021. We currently, our cows are down in Nebraska and southeast Nebraska. And in that area, they're typically done with their corn harvest by November 1st. And they really would like the cows gone by early March. And that's about 120 days. And the guy where we have them at charges 85 cents a day for yardage cost. So by doing that, that's his labor charge every day. And then the corn stalks or corn stover is free. And that's him doing all the fencing and water and the care of the animals. Mineral is charged additionally. And for us, it's about 500 miles away from us. So the two-way trip is about $80 per cow. For us to take cattle into Nebraska, we had to get health papers, and our vet helped us with that. The cows must be pregnant when they go there. They can't be open, and that's mainly for trichinosis. All our bulls had to be tested for trichinosis to be and come up negative, and then the cows are required to have a metal ID. So we did that all when we were preg checking the cows. We had an extra person from the vet clinic come and put in metal ID tags, and read the court and record all of that for the health papers. So that's an additional cost as well. Also down there, just because it's in southern Nebraska, it is most of the years they don't get much snow, and if they do, it melts quite quickly, and the cows can usually graze corn stalks all winter long. However, they do sometimes get snow, and this year is one of them. So about 2 weeks ago, I think they got snow, a foot of snow, and our cows were still grazing through that up until this latest cold snap, and they still are grazing. But he called me on Saturday, just this couple days ago, and asked, he thought maybe he should start feeding some hay. So he is feeding 10 pounds of hay right now too, at a cost of $70 per ton, which is still cheaper than any hay I could find around here. I think it was sorghum hay down there. So the total cost that we estimate it to be is about $1.55 per cow day.
Yeah. Yeah. So that last cost of $1.55 per cow day, that's essentially the experience that we were planning on for down in Nebraska, the numbers that we came up with there. Now we're starting to consider, with some of these challenges that we were faced with down there of snow and different things, is considering, maybe, well, comparing that to grazing up here. One thing that we should mention too is that last year, after grazing crop residue on this neighbor of ours farm, this past fall when he harvested soybeans, he did see a bit of a bean yield loss hit, and he was concerned that it was compaction, and so he didn't want us bringing cattle to him until after the ground freezes solid. Our neighbor up here, which typically is by December 1st, we can rely on that. Last year, we brought him there December 10th, if you remember that. But if you also remember last year up this way, and many of you aren't from this area, so you probably don't remember, but we got an early snowfall in October, and that never really melted, and the ground didn't freeze solid for quite a while later because of that snow kind of insulating the ground. And so that kind of was part of what we feel that caused that compaction issue. And he says that, in the future, he doesn't want us bringing them until the ground is frozen solid. And so that means we would not be able to bring them there until December 1st. But his cost is the cost for us to bring them here is significantly lower than bringing them to Nebraska. We can do it for 50 cents per day for corn stover, but also keep in mind that when we send them down to Nebraska, labor, fence, water, everything is taken care of down there. With here, we fenced that 180 acres that we brought them to. We had to build fence and take that fence up the following spring. And we did that relatively easily. We were able to do it within about 10 hours. Like I think I mentioned, I don't remember if I mentioned the practice round or this now, but it took us about 8 to 10 hours to build the fence around that 180 acres, a single high tensile fence, with some areas being done with a poly wire that weren't close to a road or were a long ways away from a road. We did with poly wire just for simplicity. But we built a high tensile fence. We have equipment on our tractor to roll that up quick and roll it out quick and put in metal T-posts that we had, along with some Gallagher posts where we weren't close to a road again. But that was our responsibility. But because of that responsibility, we were also, in us managing them, us going and checking them and moving them every few days, we were able to get our costs significantly cheaper at 50 cents per day as opposed to 85 cents per day. And since we're only hauling them 10 miles away as opposed to 500 miles away, our trucking expenses were only $6 per cow. He does have some fence on some of his land, but we are providing most of that. There was a question about water. This particular farmer we work with, it's a blessing to us, I guess, is very wet ground, and just about every parcel of land that he runs there has either a creek running through it or a tile line that runs all through the winter, flows all winter long. And so our cattle were drinking water. There was water available to them. This particular 180 acres had 2 sites. So they grazed from one side, and then once they got over halfway away, they got to the other water, and they grazed away the rest of the way from that water. And they were able to have water access within half a mile in any direction. And that really made life easier for us there. But we'll also have to figure out how to get them until December 1st as opposed to November 1st. And in our particular situation, we have a neighbor right next to us who's okay with us grazing stocks on his land. However, he's a full tillage conventional farmer, and he wants to till his ground. And so as soon as he's done with harvest, which is typically later than most because he's a dairy farmer and chopping corn silage himself, and he gets to his harvest of his corn a little bit later. So we are able to graze a little later than maybe some folks would be able to come in and till. But typically by November 15th or December at the latest, December 1st, he's wants us off of his ground. So we do have corn stalks available there, but just additional considerations, whereas sending them to Nebraska, we don't have to worry about that. And maybe there's, I don't know if there's questions up on that we want to talk about.
Yeah, so an individual asked, and I might not be interpreting right, but have you considered utilizing corn grazing? And they said that they have consistently gotten 200 plus cow days an acre grazing corn in January, February, with a cost around like 46 cents a day. So they're wondering, if you include land and seed and fertilizer and planting costs, then look at the numbers, including the bale grazing after that, and average it across the cost cow day over the entire system, how that pans out. Or have you considered grazing corn? But maybe they mean corn stover.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to talk about that a little bit at the end. I do consider it. We have not done it, and but it is actually something that we're thinking about. I don't think that it will pencil out for a crop farmer to do it on his land for you. But if you look at, if say a farm like us or someone with livestock, if they don't have the combine and they don't have the trucks and they don't have, all the infrastructure that goes into the harvest of the grain, I think it does pencil out working. But there are some issues, with it being so much corn, but I think there is potential there. And, we use VMR sorghum sedan grass, and that's known to have less lignin in. That's why it's more digestible. So that's why it went down so quickly in that first heavy snowfall. So there are other species maybe that would work. Some of the non-VMR varieties of sorghum or milo, I'm told, hold their leaves and maybe stand a little better, but they probably yield less energy too. So yeah, we don't have experience with that yet.
And we have a couple clarifying questions. Individuals are wondering if you rotate the cattle and how you control grazing allocation on the corn residue.
Yeah. So what I did last winter is moved them. It was probably 20 acres or so at a time, and about every 5 to 7 days or so, we were moving them to the next section. So they were getting. We didn't give them the whole field. We were still allowing them to. They would go. They had long enough that where they were definitely selectively grazing, going out and picking out the best first, picking up the corn cobs and whatnot. And by the end, they were eating the stuff they didn't enjoy so much. But at least we were able to move that a little more often and regulate their diet a little better than had we done it daily and stuff. And it was 10 miles away, and with snow and winter, I didn't want to do it, I guess, quite as intensively as we maybe could have or should have. But
when we've grazed our own corn stalks at home, we would graze them and move them every day. So like this fall on our yearling heifers, we're grazing our corn stalks before they left to go to that neighbor again this year. And I was moving them every day. And you can definitely get more utilization as long as it's dry. The problem we have in our area is often falls can be kind of wet. and they can mud it up kind of quickly.
Yeah, and he mentioned there's something I'm not sure if I've mentioned yet, but to clarify, we did this fall and winter send all of our cows down to Nebraska, but because we weren't entirely sure, how that would go, we did keep our yearling heifers back home and sent them to our neighbor again. And so they did stay, and we were actually able to graze them on stocks until January 15th or 18th this year as well, just down the road. So something else. But
so the next area that we're going to talk about is the feeding of the hay at home. We try to graze as long as we can. I believe that cattle should be eating perennial forage. Is typically the least cost is at the perennial season. In our area, it's cool season grasses as long as you can. And then after that, then we try to extend the season out by using cover crops. Primarily, we've been happiest with sorghum cedar grass in either a diverse mixture or on its own, to kind of extend ourselves as late as we can in the fall. But after that, we're using hay. And when we buy hay, we can import the fertility, and we can select out those paddocks that need the most help. We almost never feed our hay on top of the hill where it's flat, or on the bottom of the hill in the valley. Particularly, we don't feed hay in the low spots because that's where all the good soil is washed away over the years down to there. And there's tends to be more moisture and yields better. So we're almost always trying to feed on the side of the hill or somewhere where there's shallow soil. So we do really like feeding hay on our land in the winter because it can really improve the fertility. When you're buying hay, the prices vary a lot. And our calculation there of $2.56 below where you'll see that listed there was based on $140 a ton, but that can vary a lot. I mean, there's some years nobody wants hay because they all have enough and you can buy it really cheap. And some years, like the last few, have been very expensive. So, all of these different types of analogies we're using or experiments that we've done are all based, can be quite variable. But I did want to just list our yardage cost too. Works out, I think, to around 46 cents per cow per day. That's based on $20 an hour labor that we spend to check them and the feeding of them. The minimal wear and tear that we have on our feeders. We do feed all our hay in round bale feeders. We haven't done bale grazing where you just set all the bales out at the beginning of the year and then move a wire. And that's primarily because we make all of our hay as baleage. Because our climate, we typically get so much rain that it doesn't work very well to make dry hay. And so that's why we've kind of fed as we go. So we have enough feeders to feed every 3 or 4 days, typically when all our cows are around. And then the tractor cost works out to another quarter a day. So our total yardage cost, we feel is pretty accurate at 46 cents per cow per day. When you add that to the price of the hay, it worked out to $3 a day or a little over. So, but that can vary a lot. If you can get hay cheaper, I mean, that can all vary, but that's kind of where we feel our costs are when we keep them at home.
And like you mentioned, there are ways that we probably could reduce that yardage cost if we did primarily that bale grazing where we set it all out in the fall. But there you may also have a higher amount of waste than we do with our bale feeders as well, and that would have to be considered into your cost of feeding as well. But so all of that to say, we kind of have 3 options looking forward into next year and future years that we're kind of considering and comparing amongst as custom grazing in Nebraska, sending all the bred females down to Nebraska to graze on stocks from November 1st to March 1st. And so we're kind of using that November 1st to March 1st as our comparison here because that's really the only option that we can do in Nebraska. We'll have to figure out what to do before and after that. But comparing November 1st to March 1st, we see custom grazing in Nebraska as one option, or sending them to our neighbor who for the past 2 years, we've been able to graze until the middle to end of January. So if we say November 1st to January 15th or 75 days there, and then we would have to bring them home and feed hay or just to feed hay all the time. And each one of those has an advantage and a disadvantage. The Nebraska at $1.55 per day, and that's the total breakdown. That's the cost of transportation, the vet work we had to do. That's the feed, and with the exception of feeding hay when there's snow, but that's not included. But the cost comes down to $1.55 per day, or $186 per cow for that entire 120-day period. The pros is we don't have to do any labor or machinery. And remembering back to our context, I work full-time off the farm. My dad is gone most of winter. And so having those cows gone has drastically reduced my stress and workload over the last few months and has made life quite a bit easier. And so that does have value and should have value. Farmers are maybe known for being proud of working and never taking a break, but it's important to value your time fairly. We don't have to manage them. You know, I just kind of talked about that. And then it's cheaper than buying hay, significantly cheaper. It works out to about half the cost, actually. Cons is that we can't check our cattle. They're 500 miles away. We can't check them regularly. We happen to have a friend who's a neighbor to our cattle down there. That's how we made this connection. And he's checked them every now and then, but nobody will ever care for your cattle like you will. And so that's something to consider before you do something like this. If the weather goes bad like it is now and we're feeding hay in addition to all of the other costs, the yardage cost, the transportation cost and everything, the costs get pretty high. And we'll see at the end of this, we'll be able to do a calculation and figure out what it ended up being, but that is a consideration. The costs are cheaper, but still $1.55 per day. I'd like to do cheaper. We're in the upper Midwest. We have snowfall and issues that, challenge us, but people are doing it much cheaper around the country. And I'm convinced, and it may be with grazing corn, standing corn, but there are ways to reduce it, and we're going to keep experimenting and seeing how we can do it. And then they're just a long ways from home. With custom grazing in Minnesota for 75 days at 65 cents per day, and that was just an estimate, including the 50 cents per day plus transportation and other costs. Plus 45 days where we're feeding hay, and so there's that hay cost plus yardage cost at our own farm of $3.02 per day. That works out to $141. $141. I'm not sure what. It works out to $184 total. Dad did some editing to my slideshow here earlier, and I'm not sure what that's about, but it looked like $184 total per cow. So technically the cheapest option, but like anything, there's pros and cons, and it's $2 cheaper per cow, but now I have to go outside every day and feed, and take care of these cattle. So something to consider there. But another pro of it is that we get to import all of that fertility for 45 days if we're buying in hay. And we have really seen tremendous benefits through bale grazing. We started running a farm 1.5 miles away that was CRP for 15 years. And what that's done to the soil, I mean, it was biologically dead soil. And prior to trying this for about 3 years, we bale grazed all of our cows over there every year, all winter long. And that has made it some of the most productive. I mean, it's extremely productive grass, tremendous night and day difference between that bale grazing and not bale grazing. And so that is a true value that maybe hasn't been calculated in this properly, but there is value in that feeding hay. Again, kind of where it looks like now next year, if we're able to produce more cow days per acre off that, we're able to reduce our winter costs on those because of those acres being more productive. Cons is that we have to move cattle often because they're at the neighbor. We have to go out, build fence. We have to move them regularly. And when they come home, we have to feed them. And we have labor and machinery costs. And then the hay, we've kind of talked about them a lot, but we never have a pro is the cows never leave the farm. We can check them anytime, and we're importing a tremendous amount of fertility. And then the cons is that it's the most expensive option by far. And it's not something we want to do, but we're still working at different options. Account of that also is that we have to find the hay. That can be a challenge. Any thoughts to add, Dad?
Nope, you did good, Dad. I mean, we can definitely get better at marketing or purchasing our hay. It's not something we've done before much. So, I think we could improve. I have a friend who's a organic grass dairy near me, and he said he's gotten a lot better over the years of buying hay and, try to buy early and, get the contacts in area, maybe try to find truckers that are willing to haul, when it's convenient to them. There's different ways of lowering your cost. But when you go out and pay list price for things when you need it, you're going to pay.
Yeah.
I have a quick clarifying question on that slide with the different costs. Are you crediting for fertility in the numbers that you have there?
No, we're not there. And I thought about doing that, and I guess the reason I listened to, I think it was a extension agent from Kentucky or something like that. And he was talking about that, and it is very important. I mean, there definitely is value. So much of it depends on how good a job you do by, getting the manure and urine spread evenly over the field in a level that's efficiently used. I know Jim Garris said that they used to recommend that everybody use round bale feeders because it has less waste, but now they kind of recommend rolling out the hay or trying to spread it out more so that you're spreading that manure and urine more evenly. And if you do that, I think you can make almost all of that fertility that I put in there as a cost can come back out of there as a gain to you. But if you end up feeding it somewhere where it washes away or doesn't actually help that much, you can't figure it. So it's not in those numbers, and you'd have to plug in those numbers based on how you're going to feed it out and how efficiently you can capture that nutrients.
Thanks, John.
So this, I guess, and Dad's going to talk about it, but it would be if you're a landowner considering this, what do you need to think about?
Yeah, just it's probably a lot easier to find crop farmers that are interested in looking at this when the price of corn is $3.20 a bushel than when it's $5 a bushel and soybeans in the teens. I would expect it's going to be a hard sell to get somebody to take ground out of corn and beans this coming year and put it into a cover crop, that's not going to have those kinds of returns. And, that's a consideration, certainly. But there's a lot of people that are interested in improving their biology, and cattle and diverse cover crops can be a big help for that. Another risk, as Jared mentioned before, is the compaction and weather. I talked to the neighbor down where our cows are in Nebraska, and he grazes his cows every year, and he keeps them through the mud season on his crops. And he said just last year that was his best soybean yields where the cows were, even though it was muddy. So I don't know totally what's going on there, why we had compaction issues on our neighbor's land, other than it's very rare that in our area that the ground doesn't freeze. But last year was a very unusual year. The 2019 year was an unusual winter in that you could push a post in the ground pretty much all winter, which is very rare. But when you get a foot of snow on it, it's kind of like an insulated blanket, and it didn't let it freeze. And even though it was so cold, the ground was not frozen, and it was wet because the snow was probably melting on it. And when they stepped, they did compact the soil because I trust him. And he said when he went across the line, it was clear that there was compaction, and he lost yield.
And another consideration with that farm in particular is that it's pretty heavy, wet soils. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with Kent Solberg. He works with me at Sustainable Farming Association. And when talking with him about that, he talked about almost a go, no-go checklist of, analyzing your farm and your context at any given point in time. And, do you have the soil aggregation, the soil structure? Have you been doing this long enough to build your soil up to where it can handle this kind of impact? And is the given year and weather conditions align with your current goals? And last year, was our first year in trial, and maybe now knowing that going forward, we wouldn't do that same thing again, but something just to consider your own context and your own condition of your own soil types and how that, and how that'll impact it going forward. I guess it was an interesting concept to me, is, it's not all just, you shouldn't just do it because you can. You need to consider all the variables that it'll affect it. There's a whole lot more than just feed days out there at stake. So
And the last note there is infrastructure. That's a picture on the right there of our own farm. And when we first started grazing and cropping 20 years ago, I put in waters kind of throughout the farm so I could always keep our livestock out on the land. But as our herd grew, those waters weren't sufficient anymore to water them all. And you do need to have winter waterers like this, something that's capable of going late in the season, because that's the whole goal of rotational grazing and extending the season, is that you go late in the fall. And if you make your cows walk very far, they will make a muddy mess in the fall if it's wet. And that picture on the right was taken in October when we had a snow and the ground was not yet frozen. So if you walk cows a long ways away to a water place, they will make a mess. So that's a consideration. And then the fencing and having the ability to corral up the cattle if you need to work on them or load them up.
Yeah, and so through the last couple of years, we've learned quite a few things. One is that we probably can't afford to make and feed our own hay. It's more expensive than we thought it was, especially when you really consider it. And I have to take some of the fault for that. It was back in high school when I convinced Dad we needed a baler because I loved making hay at the time. But as years have gone on and I've spent a lot of late nights making hay, and really calculating the costs, we realized it's maybe not the best enterprise to put our efforts and our time and our money into. We've talked about it, just want to reinforce it. Consider your context and what are your competitive advantages? What's your soil type? What do you have that you're not utilizing? Is it corn stalks? Weather plays a big role, have backup plans. When we found out about the bean yield loss this fall, we were planning on going back to the same farmer to graze corn stalks this fall. And then he had the soybean yield loss, and that was kind of a surprise to all of us, and that we needed to not come there until after the ground was frozen solid, and we had to have another plan. We didn't have the hay to feed an extra couple months and to handle that. And so we were fortunate to find this opportunity in Nebraska, and it's the jury's still out. We don't know how it's going to end up, but it's good to have backup plans and be prepared for the worst. And kind of on the weather topic, one thing that we didn't talk about, because this presentation was specifically on custom or contract grazing for winter feeding, but what kind of hurt him in the winter feeding of those cover crops that we grazed last year was the snowfall that came at the end of January and February. If the feed days are there but they're stopped because of snow, an alternative would be to graze earlier. Like I mentioned, we grazed our first experience with sorghum sedan grass in August and September, and so maybe you want to get that animal impact, and you want to get those cover crops in your rotation. You don't have to graze it in winter. Perhaps there's an opportunity to find somebody who wants to let their perennial pastures stockpile in August and September, and you can work with them to graze earlier in the year. Find a partnership that's beneficial there, where you can have a little more certainty that you're going to get those grazing days out of that sorghum sedan grass. And also then there's some advantage for your future crop rotation too, whereas if you get that sorghum or that rye planted earlier and maybe do some roller crimping or something the following year, like we did with our organic no-till soybeans. But there are different ways to apply these principles and these practices. We're just sharing, I guess, the ones that were relevant to this title and this topic, but something to consider there.
And like we talked just a little bit before, there are other options that we have not yet tried. One thing that I've been interested in, and that's grazing of standing corn, just because I always try to see what the competition is doing. And, all the livestock farms in our area are typically feeding their cattle corn silage. And, I can't deny that the amount of tons of dry matter yield off of standing corn varieties is really exceptional. It's very good. However, it is very costly to harvest it, store it, and grow it. Corn is not a cheap crop to grow. But when you look at the amount of cow days potential there, it's pretty amazing. And there are ranchers in Alberta and Saskatchewan that are doing it quite a bit, and Western beef. If you ever want to look it up on YouTube's, there's quite a bit of YouTube videos done by Western Beef on the research that they've done with standing corn grazing. I don't know the details of it. I'm interested in it, but my feeling is I like to see cattle eating grass. Yes, I know corn is a grass, but it's harvested with grain and a lot of grain in it. And I'm not sure about the health of the cows. That's one of my considerations is, how are we going to be able to do that without founder and acidosis and that kind of thing. So that's an option that I'm interested in, or maybe doing 60-inch row corn, with cover crops in between, or, 30 inches of dwarf milo or something like that in between, or other tall standing cover crop mixes that maybe don't have as low a lignin level and stand better. But that BMR sorghum went down pretty fast that fall when we had a really heavy snow. And, that was financially really tough to take because, you put a lot of investment into that, and it was still good for the biology of the soil, but, that farmer was hoping to get some return to that better than he did. And we want it to be a win-win for both of us. And so that option, we're not looking at that quite as much. I think corn can stand better. So yeah, we'd like to hear questions other people have, comments, or things they've done.
Thanks, Jared. Thanks, John. Please, anyone have a question or comment, enter it into the chat box. We do have a couple that I didn't get to during your presentation earlier. So one to follow up on what you were just talking about, and individuals wondering about, consequences of snow. Do you have any suggestions for forage types that might stand in heavy wet snow? And do you have any suggestions to capture or harvest residue in snowy conditions?
I don't know on standability of the cover crops. It would be a good question for a seed salesperson. But I know that the BMR is designed and bred for low lignin, and lignin is what makes it stand. So you're going to have a little bit less digestible plant in order to get it to stand. I didn't quite understand what you meant about residue. I know in the harvesting, I know in Canada they do bunch, like shaft bunchers and things like that. But the problem we have in our environment is that we're a humid, wet environment. And most of that, anytime you put corn, like if you say for example, we're going to windrow a bunch of corn stalks or something like that and just leave it in the field for the cows, that wouldn't work in our area because it would rot. It would get wet and just deteriorate and would be inedible for the cows.
And then also, do you have any suggestions on how to carry over low cost forages into high forage price years?
Do buildings pay is the end of that question. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good option. I mean, we have a shed that we can put hay in, and I think that's what's so important about knowing your costs, because if you know your costs are, say $70 or $100 a ton or whatever you think your costs are, and you can buy it for $40 a ton cheaper, well, you probably should buy it if you can store it. But I only know of like a shed, or you can put up some sort of, I mean, you could wrap it too in plastic.
Yeah. And I've heard of people using large plastic sheets and just stacking them, for like in a pyramid and wrapping it in plastic for protection. But it's just something we don't have experience with, so we can brainstorm ideas, but we haven't done much of it. I do see one question in there about the allocation of, or I don't know if you had any more questions, Dad, or answers on that, Dad. The allocation of $200 for cash rent to both oats and rye, as well as the BMR sorghum sedan grass crop. I think I was looking back at my slides on my phone here to see where I did that. It was really, what we did was total up the cost for both total production things and divide it by the total amount of cow days harvested. So whether we didn't really allocate it to one. We just said, here are the costs, the seed costs, the planting costs, the harvest costs of the oat hay, and here are the seed costs and the planting costs of the sorghum, and here's the land cost. Total the cost, divide by the total cow days, if that makes sense. And there were two slides, one of which showed a $200 land cost to just sorghum. And that was essentially a separate experiment if we were doing an acre where no sorghum Sudan grass, or where no hay crop was taken off of, and all we were harvesting was sorghum Sudan. Something I didn't mention, but just something I guess kind of that you could consider your context. Like right now at our place, we're sort of, or if you happen to be long on land and short on cattle or something, if you don't have the cattle to fully stock your acres, as we're trying to get out of organic crops, we maybe have a few more acres than that we could do stuff with. Then we have cattle. We're not looking for maximum production. We don't need to own the equipment to make all that hay. We could potentially just plant the sorghum earlier and harvest maybe a few more cow days per acre. And then, whereas if we're short on feed and have more cattle than we have feed, then we could plant that hay crop prior to the sorghum Sudan and get more total cow days, but there's more hassle factor, more expenses, more equipment, and things that go into that. So I'm not sure if that exactly answers your question, but there were kind of two separate slides with two separate situations, both showing $200 cash rent, but they shouldn't have been doubled up, I guess.
We have another question here. Do you think you're paying too much for corn stock in comparison to the benefits the cows are giving landowners for soil biology, fertilizer, etc.?
Is this the Nebraska price or the local price? Because it's quite a bit different. I guess I would say that, yeah, in our area, it is really hard to find anybody who will let you graze corn stalks on their land. We're very happy to have this one neighbor that wants our cows, and he really does want our cows there if we can bring them. But I'd say most crop farmers in our area, they don't want to see a cow on their land. It's hard to find someone. So I kind of have to pay what the market is, what people are willing to do. And so that's our biggest problem, I would say, is finding people that will do it in our area.
Yeah, and you kind of have to look almost at the alternative. Sure, it would be great to bring in the fertility, but when our expense to buy and feed out the hay is over $3 a day, and we can custom graze for 50 cents a day, the benefit has to be equal to or greater than $2.50 per day to our land to justify doing that over sending them somewhere else. And I don't. So I guess to answer that question specifically, I don't think we're overpaying. If we were paying $2.50 to graze somewhere else, and we could bring it, maybe we could bring in 50 cents per cow day in fertility by buying in hay. And at that point, maybe it would be worth the hassle or worth that expense. But at the rates we're able to pay right now, and the difference between that and what the alternative is of feeding hay on our farm, I just don't think I don't think we're overpaying. It makes sense to go with that route.
And another consideration, I think, for us, because we would really like to be grass farmers and have our farm and forage all the time, if we can take our cattle and for $1.55 and take them to Nebraska and cover our most expensive months of the year, and then we could turn around in the summer and maybe graze some dairy farms heifers for 5 months in the summer for probably the same price, because they're paying over $2 a day to have them in a feedlot somewhere. We can just take that money that we get from the grazing heifers, doing what we like to do, having land with cattle running on it in the summer. Our labor supply is there. It's not any harder to move 100 heifers than it is to move 15 heifers, really. As long as they're one group, it's not much different. So I would rather have my nutrients recycling in the summer when there's growing plants there than try to make a little bit extra in the winter.
And that, what he just mentioned, is a really good point that I've been thinking on for a little while. Is, and we're fortunate that we have a seed stock market, and we have a long, a group of cows with genetics that we're very grateful for and happy to have and stuff. But should we be continuing to focus on expanding our cow calf herd? And if we didn't have that market, should we have a cow calf herd at all? Perhaps. Are there other forms of livestock classes that we can run on our land to get the same benefits of grazing cattle, where we can focus on building our soil with rotational grazing, but generate the income necessary without with just skipping the whole winter feeding cost thing altogether? And one option of that we've heard of people doing that we're looking into is custom grazing dairy heifers. when they're feeding someone 265 a day to custom graze them or to custom feed them in a feedlot, we could make it work for significantly cheaper than that. Or stocker cattle. I just had a conversation yesterday with a friend from Illinois who is a feedlot operator and custom feeds 80% of the cattle they feed in their feedlot are custom fed. And I asked him what his cost per pound of gain is. And he said, depends on the feed cost, but anywhere from 80 to $1.20 per pound of gain. Well, we could afford to do that custom significantly cheaper in the 65 to 75 cent range and be very competitive here. And so if we could custom graze stockers, bring them in May 15th and send them off October 15th and pay our bills, you know, it should be a consideration when you think about context. You know, do cow calf pairs even belong in this context? And that's something that I've been challenging myself with lately, and trying to find ways to look at entirely different enterprise mixes that still allow us to get the benefits that we love of working cattle on grass and land without the downsides and the expenses. And there are negatives to that, you know, as well. We haven't done it quite yet because it's not perfect yet, but we're working on it. So it's not a silver bullet.
And that's why I would still like to try to find a cover crop or a corn grazing operation where we can compete somehow, because I think our soils are pretty good. Without irrigation, we can get 200 bushel corn conventionally in our area. I know I talked to my dairy farming friends, and, you know, they're getting 24, 25 tons of corn silage per acre off of their corn. You know, can we somehow use that to winter our cows in a cheap way and eliminate all the overhead that they have for harvesting, and so lots of different things.
You see the last question, Dad? It's still in the shed.
Still there yet.
Yeah.
The baler's still there yet.
You have an answer for why?
No, just slow to. Maybe you can put an offer in, maybe then I'll sell it.
Yeah, you want it? No, I mean, it's something we've been looking at, is just even this next year, like, are there certain pieces of equipment that it does justify to own? Are there certain pieces where it's better to rent? And this last year we had some real big baler troubles that were just like banging a head against the wall. Why are we doing this? And it made, with the repair costs, just on the repair costs on the baler, plus the labor into the baler, we could have done all the hay we did this year for less than that, having someone else deal with those troubles. So why are we messing with it? So, you know, I think, I don't know. I can't speak for Dad. Dad's ultimately he's still the owner and stuff. So it's his call, but I think we're not too far away from that. You know, moving some of those pieces of equipment, especially as just this last summer, I took a job. And so I have even less time in the summer. And so there's other considerations, and I don't even know if I should say this. I mean, it should be looked at as its own enterprise. Perhaps it does work for you if you can justify, if you have the excess labor. I mean, it is an enterprise and it is a business, and it can be profitable if you can put enough hay through it and maybe do some other folks' hay. You know, people make money with balers, and the numbers should be done on every operation to see whether it's justifiable. And I guess it's questionable whether it is for us right now. But
no, I agree. The baler probably should go, you know, because the thing is, if your goal is to try to reduce your costs and reduce the amount of producing hay that you make, you know, why it doesn't help you if you have the baler just sitting there anyway. You know, it's rusting, rotting, depreciating away. And yes, you use it less, it doesn't cost quite as much, but the overhead is what gets most farmers.
Yeah, I think a conversation I had this summer with a grazing dairy, and what he ended up doing. He actually does own a baler, but he doesn't make any hay for himself. He has a farm, and he grazes 100% of it. And he makes hay for other people, and they pay him to use his equipment. And now he has networks with people who a lot of times have more hay than they need, and he has networks with people to buy hay from. And so, you know, it's just kind of an interesting. He recognizes that baling is expensive, and he'd rather have someone else pay him to own it rather than pay for it himself. So, yeah, that's a really good question. He called us out on. And
is it easy to get custom harvesters in your area on a good schedule?
I think that's the concern all farmers worry about. That's the first thing they say is, well, I can't get anyone to come when I want them to. And You know, it is hard. I have a friend, I mentioned before, is a grass dairyman, and he does all of it's all custom done. He does cut his own hay though. It can be done. It's a little more challenging, but it is hard. We have a farmer, or not a farmer, I guess they do manure pumping, but they also have a hay cutting business, and they have a 30-foot cutter. They could get it done pretty quick. You know, I don't like it how they stay 10 feet away from the fences. They don't want to get anywhere near the fences, and they leave it all. That, you know, bothers me. So I may keep something around to cut my own on the outside first or something like that. But there are custom operators in the area, and if more people do it, there'll be more of them.
And something I guess that we perhaps could put ourselves in a good situation is the majority of folks around us are dairy farmers trying to get high quality hay put at the perfect time when it's at optimum quality. The fact that we're beef farmers and our cows don't need the highest quality hay, we can afford to let the hay grow a little bit longer and maybe harvest it rather than harvest it like our one neighbor, I think, is 4 times a year at least, if not 5 cuttings a year. It's on like a 21-day rotation. And if we can, a thought we have if we are going to make hay that we didn't talk about too much is you know, either making hay once or making hay twice and then letting it stockpile for grazing to extend that grazing season. And if we can plan our grazing, since we don't need the highest quality, we can cut it a little bit later. We can get a little more tonnage off that cut, but it's still, you know, good enough quality for our dry cows. We can align ourselves well with the schedule of the other custom cutters who are on the dairy schedule of every, you know, certain amount of time getting it off at perfect quality. But, this guy's smart. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I've thought of that. The problem is the trucking. Like, it really, you can, but the trucking it in, like, it seems to increase the price so much to buy in poor quality hay and then to ship your good hay off. But you're right, that could be done. We could sell our good quality hay for a high price and buy in cheap hay.
Yeah.
I haven't
Yeah.
found it. So.
And I guess I'd rather, and kind of what Dad was talking to earlier is, I would say our goal ideally would be to not make any hay at all. If we could bring in some sort of seasonal livestock to where we're grazing everything, you know, we're bringing in stockers and they're leaving, or dairy heifers and they're leaving August 15th, you know, May 15th, August 15th or something. And we're adjusting our livestock stocking rate as we need to take advantage of certain levels of hay, you know, that would be ideal. And then we can, if we can find a cheap way to feed our cows elsewhere, whether that's buying in hay or that's sending them to Nebraska or sending them down the road to the neighbors, you know, neither of us, we hate equipment, we hate machinery. I can't fix anything and I don't want to. That was, I think, part of the reason I convinced Dad to get a baler back in the day was because that was when I was in high school and I didn't have to do the fixing yet. When I came home and I was, you know, the employee and something broke, I didn't get to just say, Dad, I'm heading to the movies with my friends, you know, the baler's broken, good luck. I got to do it now. And that's not our, you know, that's not our passion. That's not what we enjoy. And so the goal we're trying to figure out is how to graze everything all the time. And just focus on what we do best and what we believe is best for our soil and what we enjoy the most. And, you know, we enjoy cows. We have a good market for cows. And so that's why we're trying to figure out the winter thing still, because we don't want to get rid of the cows. And, you know, but because of that, we're still trying to work within our context of owning cows to reduce at the most we can.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? I was kind of curious about timelines when you're talking to your neighbor, before, you know, when you were initially planning the arrangement with your neighbor to graze on his land, like, what is the timeline? When do you start talking to them about it so that they're prepared to have the cows on their land?
Jared, want to go?
Well, I mean, we're already talking about with this, and you can talk to how you started talking with our local farmer and figuring that out. But the Nebraska thing was actually pretty last minute. I was down at my bull sale in Nebraska and talking with a guy at the table who's from this area, who's neighbors with this person, about how we're not exactly sure what we're going to do this winter. We just found out that, you know, he doesn't want our cattle there till the ground's frozen. And And he mentioned his neighbor. He called him right there at the table or texted him and asked him if he had any room for cows. And I think the very next Thursday they were on a truck heading down to Nebraska. So that was pretty last minute and kind of a, not maybe what, you'd recommend. But he's been doing this for years. He does it for other farmers. So it's a system he's developed, and we had a trusted kind of go-between that we knew and trusted. But I guess as far as communication, in general, just as much advance notice as possible, I think is beneficial.
And I would say locally, searching out people who you think it might fit their context. So I reached out to my neighbor and talked to him about possibly grazing there, because I know he was a no-tiller who was interested in regenerative agriculture, was raising rye. I mean, I heard, people talk negatively about people that do anything different, and he was doing things differently. But in my area, that's not normal. But he was somebody we're also different. We do things differently than most people around us too. So I reached out to him and just tried to see if that was something he might be interested in, and it was. So, but I'd say most of the crop farmers around me, I don't even talk to about that, because I know they don't want cattle. They want to go through with the combine. They have their, rippers going right behind it, and you don't see them again till next spring. And that's just kind of the way it is.